How wonderful that Susan Lacy's fellow Long Islanders have seen fit to gather here tonight to honor and celebrate their talented, hardworking, and thoroughly delightful neighbor. Yay, Susan!
Okay, this isn't a night just about me. It's about the American Masters series, which I did create, but I could never, ever have done it for 27 years without incredibly talented filmmakers working with me. And I have 3 of them up here tonight, all of whom have made more than 1 film for American Masters, in some cases 3. Michael Epstein has made for American Masters 3 incredible films. One on Hitchcock, Selznick, and the End of Hollywood, Arthur Miller, Elia Kazan, and The Blacklist, and the incredible Lennon NYC for his 70th birthday a couple of years ago. And Anne has made 2 films for American Masters, Edward Curtis and Robert Capa, one of my personal favorites. They're all my favorites, but that's one. And a film on I Am Pei. And Roger Sherman. These are all amazing, amazing films. I wish you could see all of them. And Roger made an incredible film on Alexander Calder and on Richard Rodgers. And Lennon NYC and Calder both won Peabody's, the highest award you could possibly win in our field. And such incredible talent here. So we're going to try to make this not terribly long, but we're going to have a little chat about, among ourselves, and anybody who wants to ask questions, please do, about what it means to make films about people, about the art of portraiture in film. It's a tough road to hoe. Everyone is different for all kinds of different reasons. And we thought it might be interesting just to talk among ourselves a little bit with some prodding from Jamie. About what goes into all of that. And I hope it'll be interesting for you. And please ask questions if you have any. Okay?
The reason I'm up here is to just really launch everybody. I don't think I'm going to be needed very much. But obviously, having these 4 people up here who have all done multiple American Masters films have each had probably very different experiences, largely due to the fact that all their artists are so different one from the other. So we'd love to hear, some of the ways that your subjects can differ and how the way those people are affect the way you go about making your films. So I don't know where to begin, but Susan, do you want to start?
No, I'm going to let somebody else.
All right, you start.
I want to say one thing. This was an amazing experience for me tonight. If I don't say it, I just have to say it. I sat tonight between Jamie and Christopher Foss, and it was such an emotional experience for me. The children of 2 of the incredible, Lenny obviously, but Lucas Foss also in this film, and it was really an emotional experience. I haven't seen the film in a long time. And I just had to say that. It was really touching. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Christopher.
I want to start by basically talking about Susan's process a little bit. I mean, all you have to do is watch the first 2.5 minutes of Bernstein, and you can see that it's all laid out for you. She's giving you the entire film, the entire arc, and grabbing you by the ear and saying, stay here with me for this. And it's not easy to do. And she grabbed it out of the material and obviously did it and continued throughout. So there's a brilliant way of doing it. In my 2 films, Alexander Calder and Richard Rodgers, so very different. It took me a long time in Alexander Calder to realize I think I'd burned through 5,000 or 10,000 feet of film very expensively before I realized that the mobiles that I was filming were dead. And then I went and looked at more of his footage of those mobiles from his time, and they were all moving and doing these fabulous things. And I realized because they're so valuable today, the dealers, the art galleries, weren't letting me make the move. And from that moment on, I said, well, I can't film your collection unless you make the move. So that told me something. The other, in Richard Rogers, that film started as a 60-minute film, and any film, and I'm sure it's true for writing and all, the best are films you cut down and really fit in, make very, very tight. Well, when Susan approached me, we said, okay, this will be a 60-minute film. When we handed in our first treatment, she instantly said, I'm going to have to make this 90. Never in my life have I ever heard that before. We're almost finished with editing, and I'm about 16 or 19 minutes too long for a 90-minute film. And there was some just fabulous material. Now, we're always cutting out fabulous material, but this was some really fabulous stuff. And Susan comes in, and I said, Susan, what do I do? And she looked at it, and she said, 2 hours. And that really had never happened before. But before she left the editing room, she said, no more interviews. Let the music play. Open up the music. So it wasn't just cutting back 19 minutes because I had another 20 then to go. It was no more interviews, no more talking, let the music flow. So thank you.
Very expensive words, I might add. But you know, every film has its rhythm, and it called for that. There was no question about that. I don't know why we ever thought we could do it in 60 minutes. But I'm really glad. It's one of my favorites. All of these films are my favorites.
So, yeah, I'd just like to say a few things about Susan also and her way of working. And I think the thing I admire most is she's created this series that gives in-depth portraits of artists, but she also honors the art of the filmmaker. You probably noticed from, if you've seen more than one American Masters, which I hope you all have, they're really different in style from each other. And that's because the subject matter is what teaches the filmmaker and informs the filmmaker and Susan about what the style should be. And she really, you know, gives you your head to discover what the story is of this artist. And so I just, you know, thank you. And the 3 films I've made that have had the honor of being on American Masters are all really different from each other. You know, to be allowed to tell the story the way it comes and to discover what the story is just fantastic. And so I had
absolutely unique in the world of television. Absolutely unique.
And then on the subject of, you know, how stories come and how you would approach biography. You know, for me, I have to fall madly in love with whoever the person is that's the center of my films. And the first film I did with American Masters was about Edward Curtis, the photographer of Native Americans. And it wasn't hard for me to fall head over heel in love with him because he was this, you know, rugged, handsome mountaineer photographer who loved Indian cultures. I totally related to him. Then Susan actually came to me and asked if I'd like to do the film about Robert Capa. And so I said, am I going to fall in love with this guy? How am I going to fall in love with this guy? You know, and I started doing it. It was actually, it didn't happen right away, you know. You know, he was this hard drinking, hard gambling, you know, Hungarian. It just was, you know, kind of wasn't my type really. But, you know, but Susan, you know, let me have my time to fall in love, and I did through going through the 70,000 images at the International Center of Photography and seeing the passion and humanity in him. So anyway, I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's just amazing to feel yourself honored as an artist while telling the story of another artist and to be allowed to fully express your own feelings about that artist through the work.
I just Thank you. I want to say one thing, and then I want Michael to talk, but everybody thinks if you want to make a film about somebody outside of the business, they think that, oh, you can just make a film. You want to make a film about Robert Capa? Make a film about Robert Capa. Not true. His brother, Cornel Capa, who started the International Center for Photography, had been approached probably for 30-some years by every Hollywood studio wanting to make a movie, because this man was a movie. I mean, he was all those things, but he was also Ernest Hemingway's best friend, and he had a wonderful love affair with Ingrid Bergman during the war, Paris, at the Ritz in Paris, and covered 5 wars. He was the man we know what D-Day looked like, because he was in the boats. He was in the boats coming in with those soldiers, and he died on stepped on a landmine covering his last war. There's no better movie. Could invent a better story. And interesting in that case, he really didn't want the movie made before he wanted the documentary made. I've never had that experience before. But it still took a while to work all that out and to get all those images and get the kind of access to the images. And I do want to say that that probably is the key to so much of our ability to bring artistry to this and make the films and find the stories and bring our heart and guts to it, is to have the material to work with to do that. And that's a huge element here. And it doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen without a lot of expense. But then you put it in the hands of these amazing filmmakers and art comes out of it. So the Calder film, I just have to say, Roger found such the right tone for that film. I mean, Calder was a fascinating, interesting, whimsical man. And that film has such a sense of whimsy, and the musical score is fabulous. And it has one of my favorite stories ever about an artist. When somebody asked Alexander Calder when he knew a work was finished, he said, when it's dinner time. The film has that flavor to it, so hats off. Exactly, when it's dinner time. Michael.
When Anne was talking about falling in love, you don't always fall in love. I was friends with Stephen Bach, who once upon a time was the head of United Artists, misfortune of making Heaven's Gate, and then was dumped out, and then started to write biographies. And his last book was on Leni Riefenstahl, and it was just taking him forever. And he one day said to me over lunch, don't ever do a biography of somebody you loathe. Because every day you wake up and every night you go to sleep and you spend your whole day with this person. And Stephen was a decade into life with Leni Riefenstahl, not Lenny Bernstein. But I think Susan's right, and I think it's actually access is everything. The terms of your access, getting the conversation, and then the freedom that is absolutely essential, not just artistically, but journalistically. And that's that, for me, more than anything else. I know that you're always obsessed with the budget and how much money, because Susan labors endlessly, like a lot of people on public television, with not the resources that she deserves or that she needs. But what she has is the journalistic integrity to get the access and then to let you make the film, and to give you the reach and the space, because that as a biographer, that's everything. To find it, whether you love it or not, the person, the life, but the freedom to criticize, and to know that it isn't going to get yanked away from you. Because even if in the back of your head you're thinking, if I ask the question, forget tell the story, if I ask the question, am I going to find the landscape change? And when you work for American Masters, you get the access. But then the access comes with an expectation of a certain standard. And, I had that with John Lennon and Yoko. Susan and I talked endlessly about it. And Yoko, as I said, she didn't say yes to me, and she didn't say yes to the film. She said yes to American Masters. And after that, yes, there was still a lot of struggle at times, and there was, it was a great journey. But if you don't have the freedom to say no to your subject, even if they're dead, you're screwed. You're just completely screwed, and you need that backstop, that journalistic backstop, to be able to find the note, I think.
Yeah.
I was attempted to be fired twice from Richard Rodgers, not by Susan. As a filmmaker, and I think we all will agree that we're not experts and that we go in representing you, the audience, and if we know too much, that's a problem. Ted Chapin, who's the head of Rodgers and Hammerstein organization and is I've known for 30 years, his brother's one of my closest friends, after I was hired, came twice to Susan, had meetings that I was there and said, and his job is to represent Richard Rodgers, and so he was actually doing the right thing, he thought, by saying Roger doesn't know enough about Broadway, which was absolutely true. I went to shows, but I didn't know very much about Broadway. And Susan said, no, Ted, Roger is exactly the right person, and I'm sorry, but he's going to make the film. And I whispered to Susan, just let me get him in the interview chair. And he was the first person I interviewed. And once I talked to him, he was my best friend, I was his hero, and this is now his favorite story.
Well, that raises a very interesting point that I think bears worth mentioning, which is that when you're in the business of making films about people, I think most big deal people expect to have some say over the films or the people who represent their states or represent their legacies in some way. We actually don't allow that at all. You have, whoever is in charge, whether it's a living subject or in the case of John Lennon, Yoko, or Ted Chapin, or the estates, there has to be something signed that says, we give up editorial control to you. And that's a really big thing, and that's a huge trust factor involved that we honor, but not at the expense of telling the truth and telling a real story and dealing with the ups and the downs and the failures and the demons and whatever else goes into the story to help you connect the human being to the work in some way. And that, I think, is what you're talking about. That's tremendous freedom, and I think we've earned it because of the incredible talent here. But it's not always easy to get, and it takes time, and it takes building trust and building relationships.
Have you ever lost it to somebody else because you wouldn't give that?
I don't actually know that, but there have been films we haven't done because we couldn't get it, and I'm not going to say who. But there have been people who didn't want to sign that, who didn't want to give up control, and we didn't make the film. Because it's essential. You really can't be, you have to be able to be in that edit room, as we all are as artists, finding our story, without thinking about the repercussions of it. Just thinking about what's a true film, what's a true story, what is the heart of this film and the heart of this story. And it takes you sometimes places, and sometimes it's painful. I'm sure there were elements of this film tonight about your dad that were painful for you, but you can't avoid them, or else you're not telling a true story. But it is a really big part of it.
Well, I mean, in the case of the story of my dad, there were all these sensitive subjects, and we as a family had to really have a conversation about it before we would hand the reins over to Susan, and in the end our sense was that if you don't talk about something, you actually make it look worse, and it's better to just put it all out there and take that sort of edge away. So we were all comfortable with letting Susan tell the story the way she did.
Didn't mean I didn't sweat bullets, okay? I really did. I really sweat bullets. We all do.
Yeah. Well, there was a moment when we were making Lennon, when Nixon, the night that Nixon won re-election, John, and I knew the story, that John had gotten very drunk in the studio and went to Jerry Rubin's apartment for an election night party, which they thought was going to be quite different than it turned out. And John came in and grabbed a woman and brought her into the bedroom, which was sort of right there in the living room, where all the coats were on the bed, and had sex. And Yoko was there in the living room, and everybody could hear, and somebody put Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde on to try to drown out the sound. And soon thereafter they separated, and John went to his drunken bender, which he called his lost weekend in L.A. And
Which lasted 18 months.
Yeah, and Susan and I talked endlessly about this, and how are we going to be able to do it? And you have no choice, because I think in any of these things, we were all discussing this earlier this evening. As a filmmaker, you have to take a journey of exploration. Not just in the film, but in the process. And if you don't, your audience doesn't go on any kind of journey. So if you enter the subject, or any film for that matter, saying I know everything, I'm all done, there's nothing for me to learn, you're not going to do anything.
What about Yoko? How did she react?
Yoko's
to that?
great. I mean, Yoko, that was like water on a duck's back. She could care less. She was like, yeah, let's talk about it. And she just, right? I mean,
The only thing that she really, really cared about, there were two things. One is she cared about how she looked a lot, and we really spent a lot of time on that. And she actually did think that the LA time, that time of his life where he really, really reached bottom badly. He was drinking, he was out of control, it was a mess. That we were going on too long about it. And she was very vocal about that. And said, well, it's your film. You want to ruin your film?
that was the line. You want to ruin your film? Go ahead.
We explained to her, well, first of all, it happened. It's true, and we really have to go. We have to go to that bottom place so that John can rise again and come home to you and have Sean and have this life. And it's true, but it's also a dramatic thing. And at the end, she loved the film, and she loved what we had done with it, what Michael had done with this film.
But there is a lot of stress that goes along with, doing justice to a life when that life has been placed in your hands in terms of how the story is going to be told and framed. And with Cornell Kappa, Robert Kappa had been dead for a long time when we started this project, but his brother Cornell had basically abandoned his own career as a very talented photographer to honor and preserve his brother's legacy by forming the International Center for Photography. And and Cornell had been very protective and not allowed access to, I think, a lot of projects,
No,
right?
nobody.
Yeah, and Susan was able to get that access, and so it was kind of on our shoulders, and mostly I felt on my shoulders to do justice to it, not to do what Cornell wanted, but to tell the story with the kind of power that it deserved. And I remember a rough cut screening we had with Cornell, and I was so tense, and he was, they're so horrible, and he was very ill also.
Oh, it was pain. Oh, it was so
Extremely ill, and there was so the film ends, remember this, in his apartment, and there was a silence, and then he said something amazing. He said, actually, I can't remember if he said it that night or if I was told that he had said it after we left, but he apparently said, well, I can die now.
And he did not too long after that.
Yeah.
I do want to say one thing. We don't show the films to the subjects in most cases before they're finished. Occasionally, there's something in our agreements that says they have a right to, right before we finish the film, to look at it for factual accuracy.
Alexander Calder's grandson is the expert on Alexander Calder, and I had to put him off for 6 or 8 months because I didn't want to show him the cut, and I was afraid, even though we had editorial control, he could still shut me down and cut me off from their archive. And back to what you were saying, all of you sort of, there are times in interview situations where you have to ask the question that you're not sure what's going to happen with the answer. You like to leave it towards the end. but Linda Rogers was the sister that really didn't like the limelight. Mary Rogers was the face of it. And their father was not the nicest person and not the best father. And so I had to weave my questions to get to the point of asking that. And she didn't know that that's where I was really going, and she sort of felt it, and she said, wait a minute, stop. And I hadn't asked a question yet about it. And as a filmmaker, when you stop and it's a sensitive issue, you actually turn the camera away, and that tells the person you really did stop. And she said, can we talk about this? And she basically talked for a few minutes, and then said, and I said, we don't have to, we don't have to, please God. We don't have to, we don't have to. And she said, okay, let's. And it turned out fine, and it was poignant moments in the film.
Well, that was risky, though.
Yeah.
Well, but you know, I think that biography is there's something possessive about it. You know, you take ownership of someone's life because it now goes through your filter. And especially if you're doing it in film, there's very rarely going to be a second film. There might be a second nonfiction book by a scholar or a biographer. And, you know, there's a lot of appropriation of somebody's life, because all of a sudden now people know Leonard Bernstein through Susan's film. Now, maybe the Bernstein family and Lenny would be very pleased, but at the same time, there's a lot of Susan that I see in that film, which is what happens, you know. There is a kind of, you take ownership of that life. And, you know, it's almost like an act of murder, where you, like, that life doesn't exist anymore outside you. And you try not to think about that very much. Maybe you never think about it while you're making a film. But I think that's the wariness that, you know, the children feel, or the person feels.
Which is where the trust comes in. I've said this often. You can give the same, once you've got the access, you can give the same budget, the same access to materials to 10 different filmmakers, and you're going to get 10 completely different films. And I think people don't realize that. I really don't. I think they think they just fall into place. The more seamless they are, the more beautifully they're made, that this is an ABCD process, and it's anything but. And there is a great deal of the sensibility of the filmmaker that enters into how the story is told and what parts of the story touch you and what you find in that story. I know with Lenny, I didn't really know when I started. I mean, I grew up in a household where Leonard Bernstein was like a god. So a lot of people said I started the American Masters series so I could make a film about Leonard Bernstein, which is probably a little bit true. But I did not know, in my heart, I did not know what the story became for me until I read this little obscure thing he wrote, where that thing at the end of the film is, in the beginning, was the note. And then I knew what that film was about, for me. And I'd like to think that he would have appreciated that.
I think it would have.
But so, and other people would have read that. It wouldn't have touched them. They wouldn't have gotten it. They would have made a different film. I do know that I was mainly a very well-received film, except for the Washington Post, which is the only review you remember of the bad ones, which said it was too much classical music.
There's a problem. That's the problem we have right there.
But there was a whole part of Lenny's creative output as a wonderful, whimsical, joyous songwriter, and that was covered to some degree in the film, but as a huge part of the film. Other people might have made that a much bigger part of the story. It's all, so the filmmaker very much is a part, I think, of what happens in each of these stories. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest.
How did you get started?
It's way too long a story. I'll do it very shortly, very quickly. I thought I was going to be a scholar, and I was American Studies, and I got a master's, and I did everything but write a dissertation for a doctorate. And then I was living in Rome, and I wrote this thing about how television could do better in the arts I think for the American Studies Quarterly or something like that. And anyway, people found out I was coming back to New York because I was married to a man who was, at that time, was going to become the president of Cooper Union. And I got a phone call from the president of Channel 13. This is a true story. Jay Islin, and he said, "How'd you like to come put your money where your mouth is?" What? And that's, honest to God, how I ended up at Channel 13. And it turned out I had a gift for it and a love for it. And I was working as the deputy head of arts and performance programs, and we were doing primarily full-scale art, like operas and dance programs and theater, and I realized that the stories behind the artists who created these works were every bit as interesting as anything, if not more interesting. And there was no place for it. And because there wasn't a place in the schedule for it. And so nobody could raise money for it. And so I set out to start this series. And if I tell you that absolutely not one single soul thought it was a good idea, you'd hardly believe this, but it's true. Nobody thought it was a good idea. Everybody thought it was a terrible idea. Who wants to watch programs about artists? Nobody will watch them, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, you know what? The reason that you think that is because there is no place in the schedule. Therefore, people can't get money. Therefore, they make them on their credit cards. Therefore, they do look like they shouldn't be in prime time. They put them on at 4 o'clock in the morning. Nobody watches them. So it's a self-defeating, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The truth is that these are great stories. They are movies. If we tell them well, we find the resources, we tell them well, they will find an audience.
How many did you executive produce before you said, I think I want to make one myself? Then how many more did you executive produce before you said, okay, yes, no, I think I'll make it?
Well, I started the series in 1986, and I directed my first film, I think it was in 1990. No, that actually wasn't. I co-directed a film on Paul Simon in 1990. I don't know, when was Rod Serling? I don't know, it was at least 7, 8, 9, almost 10 years into the series before I directed my first one. I didn't feel like I could give myself the job. And then I felt I could give myself the job. But I have actually only, out of 187 films, I have only directed 8 of them. And, but it is what, and I just finished one on David Geffen, which everybody seems to like a lot. I have my nights there. But I do love them, and I think that I am a better executive producer because I am a filmmaker. And I do think that's really essential to understanding what goes into these films, what it takes to do them, what resources you need, and how much of your soul is in them. And to really do give that time and that space before I get involved at all, other than discussing them ahead of time.
But you're not afraid to kick our butts.
Oh, no.
I mean, she gives us our heads, but she's not afraid to come in and say, you have a problem here, and it's got to be solved. And she'll take the film away from you if you don't do it. And that has happened. And so while she may not have made her first film for 10 years, she was very much making films.
Which is why I felt I could. But to me, the incredible thing is how hard it is to do this every year. And I said I wouldn't talk about money, and I'm not. But honestly, this series is not funded. In 27 years on the air, it's never been funded. I get a little bit of money from PBS, and I used to get money from the NEA until this year. They decided, I'm sure you all read this, that the long form was dead, and they put all their arts money into the internet because they say people don't have attention spans to watch these kind of films. So it's not getting easier, it's actually getting harder. But somewhere I think that there's going to be some magical something that's going to happen that's going to understand that what we're doing is we're not making television. We are, in fact, making a library of American cultural history. And that is important. And
when you look at this audience, there aren't too many high school kids in here or college kids. And I'm wondering if that's the next thought that you may have is what to do with all this incredible information that you can learn so much about?
Jennifer, that's such a good question, and in fact, I don't think I'm going to rest until that actually happens, because I really did start this series. I have really an academic part of me, and I know the importance of this archival material. Our interviews, by the way, I mean, I know in the Bernstein film, it's the last interview Jerome Robbins ever gave. I mean, these are valuable. This is valuable material. So as a scholar, I understand that. But I also know that when I was a student, and I was a student, serious student, that these stories touch me. And I know I raised 2 girls, and when they were young, I would actually make them look at things. I remember making them watch Martha Graham, and they did not want to watch it. They wanted to do anything but watch this film about Martha Graham. And I said, you have to watch this. First of all, I want to know how you feel about it. And you have to do it. It was at Lincoln Center. I wanted them to be there. I wanted to show them off. And they were like 14 years old or something. And I said, okay, just watch the first 5 minutes. And if you really want to leave, I'll see you at home. The lights came up, and I looked at these girls. And there were tears streaming down their face. They were enraptured. They were transfixed. They had been changed in some very fundamental way by this story about this remarkable woman who overcame all these odds to be who she was and changed an art form. And I thought, that's why we're making this series. That's what this is about. So if I can't find some way to harness that and get that out to young, I believe that young people love these stories and want to know about them. And that's the next goal. But that's a really hard road, because it's hard enough to get the films made. So, but you know what? Now with the internet and all these things, I mean, maybe we'll take pieces of them. We'll make shorter elements and get them out into schools. I don't know. I'd love any advice anybody has.
I have a question. When you just mentioned about it being Jerome Robbins' last interview, and I'm wondering whether you would ever be able to go back into the raw footage of the films that are already completed and assemble that footage in new ways, where you pull together other parts of interviews to tell a new story. Now that these people are no longer with us.
I'm going to let you answer that question, because it's yeah. Go ahead.
No. You really do mine the best of what it is, and even though we're creating the film as we go in the editing room, we do have something in our heads as we're asking all those questions. And my sense is there might be good things. Here's my editor, Chris Leam, who's done many American
Chris. She's
masters.
an amazing editor.
So, Chris, what do you think?
I think that I go back to the American Masters archives for a lot of my films that I edit for other people. We'll be in the edit room, and we just finished a film called the Broadway musical Jewish Legacy, and which Jamie was in, and we went back and we got that Jerome Robbins interview, and we looked forward to see what Jerome Robbins had said about Leonard Bernstein that related to his religion and how it informed his work. And we ended up not using it, but we do. Other filmmakers go back to the American Masters Archive and request those interviews to find material that wasn't about the subject that these filmmakers necessarily found essential to their point of view.
I will say this, that more and more we are aware of the archival importance of these. So I know that in some of the ones, even for the David Geffen film, I understood that I may never get that interview again, so I went beyond
But to make another film about your subject?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Been there, done that.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that. It's that so much of directing, or a piece of it, I think, is in how you approach the interview, the kind of questions you ask. People have limited time. Often, in the old days, you had a limited budget for film. Videotapes or solid state now is a lot cheaper, but days are still 8 or 10 hours. So, you have a window, and you have to get performance out of the interview, and you have a performance specific to your subject or the story you want to tell. So I think that these things tend not to be encyclopedic. You tend not to think that this is the last time someone's going to sit for an interview or a particular moment. There's a lot of utility that you do in these interviews. You know, get base on ball. You know, get on base, and I need to get to. You know, I got to advance my story, and then I can score a couple runs, and I'll be okay. And rather than feeling, you know, like one would do if you knew this was Jerry Robbins' very, very last interview. I can't, you know, screw Leonard Bernstein. We're going to do you, and we'll squeeze Bernstein. You know,
Right.
you would do it very differently, and I don't think to the benefit of the film. You know, you need.
Right.
You know, you have to go in, not with a surgeon's scalpel, but you have to have some focus and be a little unrelenting and a little brutal, you know, because if you let the person also talk about anything that they want, the energy just gets sucked out of the room.
I always, when I'm in the editing and I have to kill my darlings, I always think, well, I'll make an extra, or I'll do something with that scene that I have to cut, or, and then when I'm done with the film, I want to go move on. I don't really want to go back in. I mean, there are endless possibilities now for doing that, posting those, cut scenes on the
DVD
website,
extras.
doing that DVD extras and things like that. And I have done a little of that, but I think as filmmakers, we're ready. We feel like we've told the story in the best possible way we could, and we're ready to let it go and be out in the world as it is.
As we all are now, I would
I think
say.
that's a good conclusion to this evening, as people are leaving. But
Yeah.
thank you all so much for being
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you, Susan. It's been extraordinary. Thank you so much.